Well, good evening, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me to talk here this evening. It's a great pleasure to be with the IFS, talking about the issues of pension and adequacy of support for older ages. It really takes me back to the work of the three musketeers, Jeanie Drake, myself and John Hills, and if I can just say that very sad that over the last few years in the middle of COVID, we lost John Hills, with whom I worked so closely in that piece of work 20 years ago. And of course, John was an absolute doyen of the social sciences in the UK. Looking back to the Pension Commission work, I think Jeanie and I know John before he died, felt pretty good that we got many things right. And I think two key elements of what we recommended have stood the test of time very well. There were two core elements of what we proposed. One, of course, was auto-enrollment. And it's interesting that auto-enrollment has succeeded greater than our wildest dreams. I mean, if you go back to the reports of the Pension Commission and you see what we assumed auto-enrollment would do to the percentage of private sector employees who were saving for a pension, we significantly underestimated what occurred. And I know that Richard Thaler, who of course got the Nobel Prize for nudge theory, goes around the world quoting auto-enrollment in the UK state pension, private pension system as probably the greatest public policy application of behavioral economics, nudge theory, anywhere in the world. And it's very heartful that, at least when I looked at the last year's figures, it seems that that tendency to auto-enroll is still holding up, even despite the significant pressures that people are facing in their budgets today. You might have thought this was the stress point where it would come apart and people would say, no, I need that bit of current cash, so I'm not going to accept auto-enrollment, but to a significant extent it has been maintained. Of course, alongside auto-enrollment, the other core feature of what we proposed was a combination of two things on the state pension. And before we recommended our proposals in 2005, what we had was a state pension which was linked to prices rather than average earnings, and which therefore, at least in what we hope are normal times, and we hope we will get back to normal times in which average earnings over time go faster than in the inflation because the economy is driving an increase in real earnings, by definition and relentlessly over time, if you index to prices, not average earnings, your state pension as a percent of average earnings declines. And if you define poverty, as I think we should, as somewhat relative to the general standard of living in society, that means a relentless rise in poverty in old age, which is what we were facing before we reported at that time. Now, that created that problem. It also created the problem of incentives for private saving, because, of course, in response to that problem, that the state pension was getting poorer relative to average earnings, we introduced a minimum income guarantee, but we made that means tested. And the fact that we made it means tested then really meant that a lot of people didn't face good incentives for private savings. And it was that combination of things made us believe that the only way through this was a combination of two things. One, the link of the state pension to average earnings rather than to prices, a commitment which subsequently became the even more generous triple lock, combined with, and in order to make it affordable to the fiscal position going forward, a rise in the state pension age. And we believe that that rise in the state pension age was also fair between generations, that there was a fundamental principle of fairness, that the proportions of one's adult life spent paying into and for the state pension and receiving from the state pension should broadly stay stable in the face of rising longevity. Those were the two cores of what we proposed. There was also actually some set of stuff about tidying up the position in relation to women and making sure that the crediting of the 30 years for women dealt better with things like part-time work, etc., which, of course, Jeannie in particular was very keen on, was perhaps a little unsung bit of what we said. But the absolute core was that deal on the state pension, rising state pension age, but linked to average earnings and auto-enrollment. And it is really, very heartening that a deal and the cross-party support for that deal, and Alistair referred earlier to how important it is to get consensus when one's dealing with something as long-term as pensions, has stayed. It's interesting to think about the state pension age issue. I was very aware that until we stood up, and I can't remember if it was here or somewhere, but it looked rather like this, at 11 a.m. on the 30th of November 2005, no British political party had said that they accepted that there needed to be an increase in the state pension age. By the evening news, all three main political parties had endorsed our proposal that it should go up. And broadly speaking, the principle has lasted. There are now debates about whether the rise to 68 should continue, but they are based on the empirical challenge that the longevity increases have stalled. The basic fairness proposition that in the long term, if longevity goes up, the state pension age should go up, is, I think, largely accepted and has become an accepted part of the political belief. So we are heartened, Jeannie and I are heartened, and I know John would be heartened if he was still with us, by the extent to which the settlement we proposed has lasted. But even at the time of the report, we of course never assumed that what we were proposing was a perfect answer, a perfect and complete answer, which would last for all time. We knew at the time that there were some things which we hadn't dealt with. And in particular, we knew we hadn't dealt with the self-employed. And we overtly debated, what do we do about the self-employed? You can't auto-enroll the self-employed through a contract of employment because they don't have a contract of employment. You can't create an employer matching contribution for the self-employed because they don't have an employer. And we did spend some time thinking about whether we should say something about the self-employed, but we decided we couldn't work out what it was, so we didn't say it. We did put in the report, somebody else ought to look at this. Well, I'm glad that now, 17 years later, somebody else is going to look at it. We were also very clear at the time, and Heidi's figures referred to it, that the minimum auto-enrollment that we ended up with, the 5% employee with a 3% matching from employer, would for many people not be adequate. And we assumed that once that was in, that once that was accepted as part of the machinery, we would probably as a society come back at a later stage and take it up in some way, and I think we certainly ought to look at that now. So there were some things we knew were unfinished business and would need looking at even at the time of the report. But we also knew that there would be changes, because there are always changes, which we could not anticipate, but to which policy would have to respond. And I think we've seen in Heidi's presentation some of those developments which have occurred. First, we knew there was a problem of the self-employed, that they weren't covered. But since we reported in 2005, labour markets have changed significantly. There are more self-employed. There are more part-timers. There are more zero-hours contracts. Indeed, I don't think we even discussed what a zero-hours contract was, because I'm not sure that in 2005 almost anybody was aware of what a zero-hours contract was, and certainly did not have a vision of how it was to grow in importance in our labour markets. The second thing which has also occurred is the fall in home ownership among younger groups who will retire in a few decades or several decades at time. And at the time of our report, we were aware that some people might not want to save more for retirement, and it was one of the reasons why we argued for auto-enrollment rather than compulsory, because they would feel that they were going to get to retirement with home ownership, with the mortgage paid off, with a home larger than and surplus to their retirement needs as a place to live in once their children had moved out, and who therefore there was a credible story that part of their retirement income might come from a trading down of home ownership. But it's absolutely clear that we now have much lower levels of home ownership under younger people and middle-aged people. And also, we have lots of people get into retirement with a mortgage still outstanding. We are now seeing mortgage terms of 35 years out there with people who really have no prospect of paying off the mortgage once they get to retirement age. I think we can rely much less than before on the idea that housing wealth is, for a large majority of people, a potential source of resources in retirement. And that pushes us back even more to what is the adequacy of the non-housing pension savings. Now, there are other key changes as well, and Heidi has outlined those very clearly. There is this issue of lower real interest rates. It's quite interesting looking at the figures that were put up there. Of course, some people will say, but hasn't that reversed? Haven't we suddenly had higher interest rates? You know, bond yields are now 4 or 5%, but that, of course, is nominal. If you look at real interest rates, they've moved up very little over the last few years. And I think we probably are, for some fundamental structural macroeconomic reasons, in a global environment of relatively low real interest rates, long-term real interest rates, which makes it difficult for people to take completely risk-free approaches to what they put their pension funds in order to provide retirement. So there are a whole series of issues which should be addressed. And the IFS will be a brilliant, competent organisation to address them. I can't say that it would necessarily be the only best organisation to address them, because I am a trustee of the Resolution Foundation. And if I said here that the IFS is the only possible choice, and Torsten heard about it, he would kill me. But not only because my wife, Orna, is a trustee of the IFS rather than the Resolution Foundation, but also because, as we all know, the IFS is a source of excellent analysis and insight on so many issues of public policy. It is great that the IFS are going to address these issues. I will be interested to see how it develops, and I want to just end with two thoughts on where the problems might be less than one fears, and maybe one innovative idea on a problem which I think is significant. Heidi set out these issues on how the ratio of public spend to GDP might go up. But I think I'm right that beyond 2045, they assume no further increase in the state pension age beyond the 68, which is legislated. And if we assume that in 2055 or 60, we went to 69 or 70, I think most of that increase in the last 25 years will disappear. One of the things we discovered on the Commission is that 1 or 2 years on the state pension age makes a huge difference to that fiscal balance, because you're operating on two things. You're operating on both how many workers there are, if you are able to make sure that people are able to work to that age, and how many recipients are. And I think provided we stick to that principle that, broadly speaking, we should raise the state pension age in line with rising longevity, I would not be terrified that we are going to face a major problem of the fiscal sustainability of pensions. Now, of course, there is a different issue, which is that the longevity trend has changed. For about 5-8 years after we reported in 2005, the increases in life expectancy, and in particular, the increase in life expectancy after state pension age, i.e. from 65 onwards, which is really what matters for the sustainability of a pension system, continued at the trends that we were looking at the time of our report. Indeed, if anything, I was beginning to think they were accelerating. But something has clearly happened, something quite major in the last 5 years, and there has been a slowdown, or indeed a flattening, or even a slight reversal in that longevity increase. And that clearly says that, yes, we should look at when and whether we go ahead with the increase to 68. But that's not a diversion from the principle of proportional increases in state pension age. That is simply applying it sensibly in the face of new information about what is actually empirically happening to longevity. So my gut feel is that that issue of how fast we increase the state pension age and how well that relates to the fiscal sustainability, we may find a way through that. The other issue on the state pension age, however, is this issue about social equity, the equity of the fact that some people, when they get to state pension age, are still very healthy, both mentally and physically. That tends to be particularly if they've done professional jobs rather than manual jobs. It tends to be things to do with their health which somewhat reflect their incomes and their lifestyles. It tends to mean also that they live for longer after retirement and they just get more state pension age. So there is an equity issue about one state pension age for people with different occupational histories and different average expected life expectancy. And of course, many systems in the world get round that by actually having a contributory system where the age at which you get your pension depends not on a definitive age, but on how many years you have been paying into the system. This is an issue, but I want to make the point that it's not an issue created by a rise in the state pension age. It is an issue inherent to having one state pension age which applies to everybody. It was an issue in 2000. It was an issue in 1980. We didn't talk about it all that much, but even in 1980, we had lots of people from manual backgrounds who were living much less in retirement than professional people. So is there a way round that? This is one thing that I wish we had looked more at back in the Pension Commission work, though I have to say we were very constrained about it. One of the little hidden histories of our report is that we weren't really meant to look at the state pension itself. We were only meant to look at private pensions. Some of you may remember that the issue of the Commission was a subject of considerable tension between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and we ended up in some wonderful fights. And one of the things that Gordon had insisted on was that this commission was looking at the private pension side of the issues and not the state pension. Well, John and Jeannie and I made a strategic decision that we would argue that we couldn't possibly solve the private pension issues without addressing the means testing issues on the state pension side. Therefore, we had to say something about the state pension, and we said something rather big about the state pension. But we were still a little bit constrained of going into great detail. And one of the things that I wish we'd looked at, and I think we may look at it again, is can we do something clever with exactly when people get the state pension and with some tiering in that which would address this equity issue. Suppose at 66 there was a means-tested state pension, but at 68 there was a completely universal non-means-tested state pension which millionaires get as well as the poorest people in society. You would create a mechanism where poorer people, which would tend to be the less healthy people, tend to be the people with the lower expectation of life during retirement, would have access on a means-tested basis to a state pension 2 or 3 years before other people. I suspect there are ideas in that space that we should look at. But there are also lots of other issues that you should look at, and they include in particular this crucial issue of the shift of risk that has occurred, the shift of who bears risk from the DB environment to the DC environment, and the impact of the pension freedoms. Pension freedoms, which I have to say were introduced by the then Chancellor in precisely the opposite way of the reform of the pension system produced by the Pension Commission. There are 2 ways to introduce public policy on an important long-term issue such as pensions. One is for government to support or to ask inputs from expert people trying to look at the whole of the issue in an integrated fashion. Another is about a month before the budget to say, I'd like to have something dramatic to say, can my civil servants come up with an idea of what that should be? I hope that this report will make a major contribution to the former and more appropriate form of policy making in respect to the future of pension provision. Thank you very much.